Good evening, everybody. And, well, not that many of you look totally soaked, but still, thank you for enduring this weather for us and to visit what's going to be a very exciting night. That's what I'm promising you that. It's going to be an exciting conversation. Why? Because somebody wrote a book. And it's not just a book, you know, it's a pretty big book, and it's also a good read. And it's called Designing Change. So it's probably dealing with one of the leading questions, or not probably, it's dealing with one of the leading questions of the whole WeMakeThe.City festival. And that is, what if a city becomes more at the center of where people work, dream, live, want to, you know, enjoy their leisure activities? You could basically say that the 21st century is often called the age of the city, right? So you probably know more about that than I do. So it means that cities have to change. They have to deal with more people. They have to deal with sustainability, with participation. And the question is, how do you do that? Well, when it's about a little before 10 p.m., you will know, okay? So that's why this is such a great night. Because we have some of the best people to have this conversation amongst each other and with you. So let me briefly tell you what we're going to do, and then I'm going to ask a couple of questions to you, not that many, but just to give our guests an impression of who's actually here in this big hall. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what does designing change matter. We have Eric Verdi. He'll be here in a few minutes to introduce his vision and his book project. And he invited a couple of speakers from across Europe to join that conversation with us, from Venice and from Berlin, and also Ton Schaap from Amsterdam, that you may already know if you're from this city. And we will ask them to talk about some projects in which they really see how the challenge of dealing with designing for change comes to life, right? So we'll be moving from Berlin to Amsterdam to Antwerp, but we'll be seeing quite a few examples of specific projects that deal with this paradox of new density and also with participation and sustainability and all those challenges that we are facing today. So we'll do that, and we'll ask you to, you know, relax, enjoy their great pictures. But then around 9, we're going to do it the opposite way. And because we thought that there are so many people here who are also practitioners, this is what I'm going to ask, who have their own vision. So we're going to ask you to more or less moderate the debate between these speakers. And ask your own questions. Hopefully you stay a bit on topic, but if not, we're just going to, you know, leave that question behind. You've experienced this, everyone, now and then, right? But basically, the floor will be yours from about 10 minutes after 9, 10 minutes after 9 onwards, after we've introduced these guests and the topics of tonight. So before we ask Eric here on the stage, it would be nice for all of us to know who's actually here. So who's been enjoying a full day of the WeMakeThe.City festival? Who's really here like, wow, that's been a long day? Okay, so there's a couple that really managed to be here. Who's been doing 2 days already? Oh, wow. Yeah, let me ask you for one highlight. Can you tell us one highlight of 2 days of WeMakeThe.City?
One of my highlights was the moment on the opening night, when there were so different speakers that the one who had to speak there didn't know anything to say anymore, because she was influenced by all the different meanings, and she was really in a sort of design mode, what to say.
Okay, so
I like that she was interrupting with herself. So it's really about changing and designing.
Okay, so the best moment of this festival was a moment of silence, but it was very creative and inspired. Okay, is there anyone here who would say, yes, I'm an architect? If I would have to label myself here, you know, suppose you still believe in labels, I'm an architect, yeah. So there's quite a couple. Who would say, well, maybe not an architect, but I'm an urban planner, urban designer, that feel? Wow, that's quite a couple of people working in that field who say, well, actually, I'm not that yet, but I'm studying the stuff, you know, so I'm becoming one. So that would be you, okay. And who would say, I'm working for a government, so I'm more on the policy side of designing for change, okay. Anyone here who says, well, I really need to tell you my profession, otherwise it's going to be a bad night? No. Then before we ask Eric Furley and hear his view on his book, etc., I want to hear 2 statements on what, according to you, are the big challenges if you think about the topic designing for change in all those cities, especially Amsterdam or maybe other Western cities that you're from. What would you say, this is really on the top of my mind, we really need to start by bringing in this thought of idea? Yeah, so we have one person here who really knows how to set an agenda. Great.
Well, thank you for letting me. I think that we are in an interesting position that we use a lot of more technology in our cities. And much of that technology is being used to disempower people, to increase control and keep people from getting ownership again. And I think we should strive for cities that actually embrace participation and also help people to use technology in a way that's better for them.
Okay, thank you. And this is your field, it seems.
Well, I've been a research director at Waag Society for 10.5 years,
okay.
Thinking about smart citizens as opposed to smart cities. Mm-hmm. So that's why I'm here.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a great point for the agenda. I can see Eric nodding like, wow, this is a new book, maybe even. Yes, one more. I promised that there would be 2 points for our agenda. So we have power and technology and inequality, and your topic would be?
I think it would be interesting to see how future cities cope with reintroducing nature back into our lives. I think one of the biggest vacuums in this world is the lack of spirituality, and also the nature, the wildness in our life.
Okay. So the nature, the lack of reintroducing nature and the wildlife into city life, which goes beyond just a park, if I understood you rightly. Okay, thank you. So we have power, technology, inequality as a theme, and we have this idea of spirituality, nature, wildlife. That would be a great moment to ask the person on the stage who inspired this whole evening. Can I get a warm hand for Eric Furley? Eric, please, take a seat or stand, whatever you prefer, but please take a microphone. So there's this book. You have a publisher who really know how to push a product, right? So it's here and it's here. So it's on 2 sides of the table.
And on the back.
And on the back. Yeah, you can buy it as well, you know, get a discount. But it's called Designing for Change. It's many interviews mostly with people that have played a big role in various cities from a designing perspective. Why did you feel that? Because it's quite a project, right? So why did you feel that you needed to write this?
Well, I mean, there are many reasons. I think, first of all, thanks for the invitation. Thanks for you to be here. And I think one of the reasons to do such a book is, obviously, it's a book which is meant to communicate about urban design and cities. And that's the format of the book as well. So most of it is made up of interviews, 12 long interviews, which are illustrated, and several project presentations. So that's the book in itself, but it's also meant to be a tool for evenings like this one. Mm-hmm. So, what I realized through my, professional experience when I was still practicing, and then now teaching at the university, that this actually doesn't happen that often, as much for experts to exchange between different countries, between their practices, because urban development still tends to be quite local. The developers tend to be relatively local. Obviously, the city planning offices are local, and the exchange happens less than one might think. And that's an exchange between experts. The other one, and I think that's why an event like We Make the City is very important, is the exchange between the experts and the wider audience, the citizens who live in the city, who might want to have more.
And that's probably why you chose the interview forum, right? To make it more accessible for everybody.
Exactly. So, and once again, if it becomes more accessible, depends. It's a book. You have to be realistic about, how many people might actually buy it. I think it's very readable. I tried that with my family. Maybe they don't tell me the truth, but apparently it's something which is not only interesting for those experts, the architects, but it's really meant through the interview format to be accessible to everybody. And I think that's a topic, and I think tonight we're going to talk a lot about participation, which becomes more and more important. It means like if we want to have this conversation, which we already had in the past, but I think it's something that we are looking for more and more, then we also need some kind of building culture, in order to make this exchange as fruitful as possible. And that's the whole idea of this book.
So in this book, you basically present interviews with for example, the people that are very well known here, like Winnie Maas and Adriaan Geuze. And there's many others, some of which Paula Vicano and Recola Luce are our guests tonight. But basically, you've been around the world, but you also stated that you're dealing with the tension between, on the one hand, a more or less Western-based book, whereas on the other hand, the big designing projects are now taking place in Asian cities and to some extent African cities, right?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's quite an, you just said we're in the age of the city. It's interesting to see how in just about 10 years, I think even the academic discussion has changed, and how there has been influences now coming back from the Middle East, from Asia, and influencing as well our cities. Not always in a positive way, but I think that's a challenge that we are dealing with, which also gives us many opportunities. So that's again also one of the reasons why this book is very global. If I say global, it's maybe a little bit exaggerated. So essentially, we have 8 European urban designers, we have 2 American urban designers, and 2 from China. So that's what was feasible in this format.
Now, your book range is ranging more or less from 1980 to 2020. So you're also, you have some idea of what's going to happen next year, which is fine. Now, to some people, that would be saying, well, we started with Ronald Reagan and now we have Trump, so what's changed? But a lot has, right? A lot has.
Well, I think it's exactly that, because the reference to Ronald Reagan and to Margaret Thatcher came up several times. I think once by Paula Vigano and by Adriaan Geuze. And but the truth, I think, of this range as well is that we unfortunately all of us have a finite life. So I think to go from 1980 to 2020 also meant I wanted to talk to people who are still in practice, who are young enough and have enough energy to influence the future. So how far back can you go? In order to talk about their own experience.
Yeah.
So Albert Speer, for example, unfortunately has deceased since we did the interview, and he was something like around 85 years old. But he had done his first projects in the 80s, maybe.
And one of the things you have a couple of statements, but the one that made the most impression on me is that you said what we're living now, it's in architecture, it's now possible to be nostalgic for postmodernism, right? Because postmodernism is really something from the past. That seems to be your statement.
It's one of the statements. It's actually something that I asked several of those urban designers that I had the chance to interview. What was their point of view of postmodernism? Because we are here. Well, we are not in Rotterdam. We are in Amsterdam. But Winnie Maas obviously is somebody that I guess most of you will know. And I found it kind of interesting how a practice like MVRDV would relate to those ideas of postmodernism. Because I think probably 2 decades ago, when they started started, they would have done anything possible to distinguish themselves from the postmodernism that was this kind of backwards-looking postmodernism. While if you have another reading of postmodernism, the way you communicate with, relate to mass culture and communicate with the public, then essentially the work of MVRDV is particularly interesting to analyze in regards of postmodernism.
Okay, so if you think about how to engage with local people in a local community, it's pretty much there. But the big buildings that you're referring to, they seem to have made place for buildings that are more open to sustainability, that seem to have a bit of a warmer feeling to them.
Yeah, one might hope so, or trying to achieve that, at least in terms of communication. Even though I think this postmodern communication was a different one. It was mainly through the terminology of the buildings, but not that much through the participation of how you would actually conceive them, how you would develop the program. And I think that's the stage we're in right now, which is quite different.
I'm going to ask your comment on one of the statements, and then before maybe you want to say one more thing about the book, and otherwise, it's inspired the whole evening, so we'll invite our other speakers. But there's one statement here that might be interesting for the crowd we have, and it says, "The architect as the urban designer's best enemy." And that's one of the key findings of your book in the introduction, right? So why is the architect the urban designer's best enemy? Could you explain that?
Well, we had a small event last night, and I regretted actually speaking about this point again. And I think the point that I made is that you tend to make yourself enemies in this kind of a group of people. Because many people who tend to attend these events, and actually I'm quite happy that we don't have that many architects or urban designers. It really seems to be a mixed crowd. It's actually quite difficult to address. But often we do have a majority of architects, and it's kind of part of our education as architects that we consider ourselves automatically to be professionals of city making. While I think in order to become a professional of city making, you might want to do it for a certain amount of time. And I think what I meant with the enemy is that how the media works is often if, let's say, a newspaper, a magazine for the wider audience is interested to make a piece about the city, then they might often turn to famous architects.
Right.
But these architects are not necessarily professionals of city making. They're just very good architects.
Okay, so they make great buildings, but they don't make great cities.
Often this can happen. So I believe it's something that sometimes breaks the development of our profession and its credibility. Yeah. Is that for the wider audience, sometimes we have to fight with some comments that you read, which are so simplistic and do not really fit into the reality.
Now, we are definitely not having a psychological session here, and we don't want to have one. But still, you were trained as an architect, and you really bent over to become a teacher about city making and practice. Is this also, this battle between the architect and the urban designer? Would you say that's what you're always thinking about finding that right balance?
Yeah, I think it's always, I realized many things one complains about. It's not just in architecture, whatever. It's actually because you feel them in yourself. So you're trying to fight against yourself.
You try to fight against yourself.
That's the psychology that you're talking about. So I think actually I am an architect, but I'm trying to be an urban designer.
Okay.
But to come back to the... and actually, I'm not practicing anymore. So in a way,
the enemy has won. It has beaten. It has beaten the architect, right?
Maybe academia has beaten me. But in terms again of why doing such a book as a full-time teacher, which could be considered to be kind of a vulgarization, but that's something that I consider to be part. I guess some of you are also in academia, and I think that's something that increasingly is maybe part of our mission, also in academia, is to make this link. It always has been, but to make the link between the different professions and between ourselves and the wider audience.
Okay.
And so I'm trying to find my space there.
Thank you. I think that's very clarifying for most of us. But is there anything that we definitely need to know before we start off the conversation with our guests, or should we just call them to the stage?
I think we should call them to make this more.
In that case, let me start with introducing to you Ton Schaap. He works mostly in Amsterdam, and you may all know him as being the supervisor now of the South Axis and also being responsible for many projects here in what we now call the Amsterdam waterfront area, ranging from the area called Houthavens all the way to, for example, Java Eiland. Can I get a warm hand for Ton Schaap? Ga zitten. Eric, and then there's two other guests that you know better because you interviewed them. Can you tell me who they are and why it matters that they're joining us tonight?
So once again, one of the reasons to do this book is to use it as a tool for the organization of such events, and I'm very proud to be one of the modest reasons to bring people like Ton Schaap in contact with Regula Lüscher and Paola Vigano. So just two words to present them. Regula Lüscher, by the way, wrote the preface for this book. And she is the Senatsbaudirektorin of Berlin, which is essentially the director of planning of the city of Berlin, which I think has the particularity to come because it's a city-state with a political mandate. So she's also a state secretary of the city of Berlin. I think maybe later on she's going to explain to what extent it makes a difference. Regula is not German. She is also German. She also has a German passport, but she is born in Basel and studied architecture at the ETH in Zurich. And then afterwards, I think after spending a year even working for Krishanitz in Vienna, she practiced with a partner about 10 years. I think a successful practice doing housing, schools, and I think some urban design. And then I think somehow through a hazard or through invitation became involved into city planning for the city of Zurich and ended up to be, I think, the vice president of the Department of Planning before she was again invited to Berlin in, I think, 2007 to become the director of planning. And apparently was, I think, quite impressive for somebody who has a political mandate, has already survived two political changes, so has been kept in her position. 3 or 4? Or 4. Okay, which I think doesn't happen every day. So, please welcome Regula Lüscher. Who I think is also a honorary professor of the University of Arts in Berlin, which I forgot. And I might directly also introduce Paola Vigano, who is Italian, I think from the north of Italy, from the Alps initially. She did her studies of architecture in Florence and her PhD in Venice, and opened with Bernardo Secchi a practice, I think in 1990 already, even before she finished her PhD. And so is still practicing and is at the same time a full professor at the University of Venice and at the University of, not the University of Lausanne, but the EPFL, the Polytechnical School of Lausanne, and also heads the Lab U, which is a laboratory of research for urbanism. So please welcome Paola Vigano. Who won, I forgot that as well, the Grand Prix d'Architecture de l'Urbanisme in 2013, and the Flemish prize of the Ultimate prize of architecture in 2015.
Okay, well, we have a full stage now. Welcome once again, all of you. We all asked our guests to bring in a couple of cases or a case that they found interesting. But maybe first, briefly, we asked you over a statement on the topics of tonight. So we said, well, dealing with density, with participation, and maybe if you already have an opinion on how to deal with inequality and digitalization, or with wildlife and nature, and bring it back to the city. Just an opening statement that learns us a bit about how you look at those challenges. Ton, can you deal with all of them, or maybe just one?
I can try. I think the bigger the issue is, and the more people are involved, the more relevant the result of participation is. I think you need an example. For example, getting the car out and the bike in is something that really came from bottom up, from the population of Amsterdam, and planners, well, leaped behind. So that worked, because it's still working, and it's not finished yet. But that's something that is where participation and where the opinions of the people have been very crucial.
Right. So that's an example of, let's say, the sustainability challenge, also the lack of space, but you need that bottom-up movement.
The green point on the agenda, which is now coming up, is the same kind of thing, only it's much more recent. And the bike thing came up already 35 years ago. Getting the car out, that is now a project almost finished. That is a new project.
Okay.
So this is how it works.
And you need a mass to support it. Okay, Eric, do you also already have, now in your different role as being one of the guests at this table, do you also have an opinion on those topics, a statement you could make, like Tom?
Well, there's one person actually who was not able for medical reasons to join us, which was Bruno Fortier from Paris tonight. And what I had to think about was, our interview turned about the topic of the artifice and nature in French urbanism. I think one of the points that apparently we also would like to discuss tonight is, I think, a certain tension that we have in today's discussion about making the city greener, with even more air, more space for our kids to play. But on the other hand, the kind of ecological need to densify it. Right. Also social needs sometimes, depends on the city context. So and that's obviously something which is quite difficult to... So I'm always looking for topics which are a little bit problematic, rather than something that. Now
you yourself, you're based in Miami. Would you say generally it's the same challenge? It's a global challenge, or is it very different there than it is in Paris?
No, I think it's different. What I'm very happy about in Miami is that we are getting to a stage now that this kind of plurinodal city is starting to densify its urban cores, which were not really urban cores. So they were not strong enough as a pedestrian environment to really be used. And this is, it's not sufficient the way it's now, but there is really a move back to the city with all, problematic issues of the apartments being too expensive, the issues that we have in many places, but we have a move back to creating pedestrian environments. While I'm looking at a city like Amsterdam, this doesn't seem to be the biggest problem to have a pedestrian environment, right? It's very attractive. Yeah. So I guess what we have here is maybe this kind of tension between the people who are already living in the city center, who have the means to do so, and maybe would like to improve the quality of life. And how can you actually combine this with the need, if there is a need, I'm not sure if there is one here, to further densify, to build more buildings, which is not necessarily something that you
I think we'll get to that later. And also I think the really expensive market is a topic here almost every week. But now, for the moment, let's move to Recula. Could you also, we have a microphone for you. Now, not willing to become too political, but today it was all over the news that Berlin is freezing rents for the next 5 years. Is that something that matters when you think about this density participation challenge? Would you say this is a great big moment? Or?
Yeah, it's something that matters a lot, of course, and I think it's also driven by the citizens that are going on the street and they protest and they really suffer. They suffer of the growing and the rents that are going up and up and up. It's also a result of the citizens who are going on the street, and we see we have to do anything against this global problem. It's a global problem, and it's very, very important.
And it's a bottom-up decision. This
It's
decision
not
was
a
being
bottom-up
made?
decision, it's a reaction of
to a bottom-up movement.
yeah.
Okay.
It's a reaction of the politicians, of us, my senator, and
Now, if Berlin is anything, it might also be known here for its fancy startup economy. Do you recognize the problem of digitalization and smart city tools being in the hands of the well-off and not being made for the poor, like it was said in the back? Is that an issue in Berlin?
Yes, it is an issue, and it's when we are talking about participation, it's also an issue about the question how you can reach target groups, and it's very difficult to reach very different target groups. And, yes, one thing is of course the social medias, and yes, there are people that are able to deal with it, and other people they are not able.
So it's there as well. Okay, then briefly, Paula, could you also comment on one of these big challenges that we've been putting here on the table?
You mean beyond the densification?
Well, maybe you can say something, whatever, as long as it's densification, participation, wildlife and nature, or digitalization, one of those four, just do some cherry picking.
In fact, there are very, very fundamental connections among all these questions, but we will see maybe later. But let's say about the densification, I would start by, this one first statement is to say that densification, so not density, but densification, so the process of becoming denser and denser, which is, when we say density, it's just a ratio density, no? Can be high, can be low, can be, it's nothing.
Right.
But densification means the process of becoming, no? The city, the history of the city is a process in general of densification. And then there are moments in which there is no need, or there are events, catastrophes, and then the city maybe lose or becomes less dense, or there are strong decisions to reopen some spaces. So we are inside, I would say, one of the main trends of the city history, densification. And you add the piece, and this is the palimpsest. This is constructing the stratified city. This is one side, but the other side of densification for me is that when densification becomes a rhetorics, as today it is very often, I don't know what is behind that rhetorics. So I think that is very important that citizens maintains kind of alert on this, because behind densification there might be other agendas.
People would say, let's say a politician or somebody who is in power would say, we need to densify.
Yeah, because it's good today to densify, because it's more sustainable. Yeah. Maybe. And then let's give a look.
Okay, and then so somebody would say that, and immediately we have to become critical, right? That's your advice.
Immediately we have to look into.
Yes. And what will we find then?
That could be different depending on the situation, but it's very important to be very attentive.
Okay, you have a shocking example of something that you would say, well, people were saying density
it's
and we're
enough
doing
to go
it
around in many cities in the world. I'm sorry to say that, but it's like that.
Okay.
Behind densification, there is not always sustainable cities.
There's often gentrification, there's slum clearing, there's pushing out of people.
but also not really more sustainable cities.
Okay, Eric?
Well, and I think there is the link between this rhetorics of densification and also, the favoritization of the high-rise typology. So actually, when we did the tour today here, I was quite happy. I even wrote a book about high-rise urbanism, so I don't have a problem with towers. But I think there seems to be a tendency just to take this typology for granted.
Like there's no alternative.
Like there's no alternative. And I think this is part of those rhetorics of densification. We have to build those towers because they can be denser, because they're good for our city marketing. And, are they really? I think that's a question that has to be researched.
Okay. Well, thank you for making us aware and critical. We asked all of you to introduce a couple of examples. Now, there's a certain order in the keynote. Let me make sure that I get it right. So first, I think we're going to Berlin. Yes. So Regula, maybe you already have a microphone. And you have, do you want me to do the slides for you, or are you going to do it yourself?
Yeah, maybe. It's nice if you do it for me.
Sure, absolutely.
If you really like it.
And as to the others, I'm having this terrible back problem, so I keep standing. But you should only stand if you want to stand. But there's nice, comfortable chairs for you.
So you would like?
Yeah, if you want to look, there, yeah, you could also do it. Yeah, as long as Recula stays here with us.
And you would like to have us sit down?
No, whatever you choose. It's just that I don't want people to feel obliged, to keep standing when they actually want to sit. Yeah.
Everything is okay.
Okay. So there you are.
Yes. Okay. I really make the focus of participation, not of densification. So we are in shared roles, and for me, creating is discarding. And why I'm saying this, we need participation and excellent architecture and for good urban design, because opposition and discussion set creative processes in motion, and that's why it's so important to have discussions. Next, high quality built design, so-called Baukultur, needs a culture of dialogue. It's very, very important. And one example in Berlin is I created a quality team, or a board of experts, and we discussed the most important projects with these experts. And it's open to the public, and it's very important, because then they can understand, or more understand, what's all about urbanism and architecture, and what are the ideas of the investors, but also what are the critics.
So they can sit in and listen to this conversation.
Yes, you can't see them. They are now on the other side of this picture. So
but there's 2,000 people sitting on the other side.
This is the quality team and the investor, and we are at the moment discussing about high-rise buildings.
Okay.
But it's very important that it's open to the public and also to the newspapers, and they are writing about it, and so it's also a kind of participation, or it's more kind of transparency, I think. Yeah. Next, participation needs clear guidelines. That's very important. And one example in the Central District, the so-called Mitte, that's the picture. There is a very big issue is on this plot. Building or not building, because this was the historical center of Berlin, and then I don't have the time to explain it, but it's all about building or not building this area. And 2 years of grassroots participation was successful because we had clear structures. We had the opponents were part of the steering committee. I mean, the opponents since 20 years. There were really battles about the space. We had clear roles of the stakeholders. The members of the parliament swore their loyalty to the process during 2 years. And we had we had clear decision processes. The result of the citizen participation process was meant to be approved by the parliament decisions. So it was very clear for everybody, for the citizens, that at the end there will be a decision. And this is very important.
So maybe there is for not everybody reads German. Is there one of these guidelines that stands out?
The citizens made this guideline, and the parliament, they said, yes, it's okay, we go with these 10 guidelines for the next future.
And they were the outcome of this 2-year process?
This was the outcome of the 2-year process.
Great.
So, yeah. Next one. Participation needs multiple instruments for the dialogue to reach the different target groups. And you need, next one, strong images. It's also the center of Berlin. It's the same as you've seen before. To confront and discuss. You need pictures that provoke emotions. So you come in a really hard discussion. Next one. You need different instruments to reach also children, younger people, immigrants, all sorts of people. Unusual events, for example, it's a kind of participation theater. We made exploration tours and so on and so on. So you need really, really a lot of very different instruments to involve the people. And next one, you need very poetic drawings like this. This was a competition in Tempelhof. I don't talk about this. It's another story, but I think it's a very beautiful image where the red point is. There is this hill, and it's of course from the film of Wim Wenders, Himmel über Berlin, and so it brings a lot of emotions.
And this was. These pictures were being brought into the participation.
Yes, by the architects,
process.
of course, by
the
landscape architects.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Then next one, participation means co-working, cooperation, and active involvement. It's not only about discussing. Mm-hmm. These times are totally over. They are really, you can forget it. Especially in Berlin. In Berlin, participation is really a hard battlefield because. Yes, because all the refurbishment, for example, the landscape architectures that you have seen before, the people didn't want to have it because they are so afraid of gentrification. So it's always, you have big discussions. If you want to make, for example, densifications. It's really, I mean, I hate this word. It's a horrible word. You can't use it. Yeah. And here's an example also of densification, and it's just in the middle of Berlin. It's a so-called Haus der Statistik. It's a very important building in Berlin. And there we really try to bring the activists and the initiatives into in a co-working situations. And we have 5 partners. We have the public finance administration that, yes, needs some space for the administration. We have the local district or the borough. They want to build a town hall. They need a town hall, yes. We have the activist initiatives that want to build artists, rooms for artists, for the community, and social housing, affordable housing, and so on. We have a public housing company that built affordable housing, and we have the ministry, the Senate, and we try to guide this whole process. And I think the most important thing is that these partners, they are very, very different, totally different, and but they are on the same level in the discussion, and they have the same rights, and that's very important. And we start in next picture. This is this House of Statistik, and it's really totally run down. It's from the GDR modernism, and it was also important that we kind of seize the moment, kind of the zeitgeist, because nearly 30 years after the reunification, the GDR architecture experienced kind of a new reputation. This was also very important because the plans were in the beginning to tear down this building.
So what used to be ugly is now a monument.
Yes, it's now kind of a monument, and the initiatives, they really strongly fight it for this building. And yes, we had a workshop, competition, a lot of participation, and we also had very good professionals who are very good urban planner and architects, but also totally able to listen and to understand what the people want and to bring it in their design. That's also very important, because it's really about a shared authorship. You can't do it city planning, I can't do it alone. I need partners, and I need the citizens as partner, but also architects, urban planner, and so on. And what is really interesting, this plot is really in front of this huge master plan. It's the master plan of Hans Kollhoff. It was after the reunification from the early 90s, and it's really the center of the investors-driven urban development. And we have on the other side this House of Statistik, which really stays for an alternative kind and way of how you can plan.
So
cities.
It's like an island within that master plan approach.
No, it's not an island of the master plan. It's just opposite of the master plan. It's really just opposite. And yes, I think Berlin is a kind of a, somebody once said, it's le génie de l'improvisation. We are really good in improvisation, and I think participation is all about time. You need a lot of time, but it's worth. You need you have to create a trust between the partners. And this needs time, and this needs a lot of discussions and a lot of battles. And you need a lot of experimentation, sense for experimentation. That's also very, very important. And I think for that Berlin is not, it's not the baddest city. So thanks.
Thank you.
That's it. Sorry for my voice, but yeah.
No, I think we're going to move to Paula Vigano, but I think really what we really should discuss later on is the way in which you use the word battle as almost like a positive term, and I think people who are here from the Netherlands maybe even be. Let's say, happily surprised that somebody is also working for the government, actually enjoys battling instead of making everything inclusive and what we would call here the Polder model. But let's get to that. Unless you say this is such a provocative statement, I need to answer it right now, and otherwise we'll hold on to it for the discussion. And then, Paula Vigano, I would like to invite you to come up. Yes. Yeah, why not? It was a great presentation, so why not clap for it? Yes. Would you like to do your slide yourself? Okay, there you go.
Okay. Okay, we can start. First of all, I have to say that I'm not against density, even in some cases high density. This is a master plan we have designed in Antwerp. Is the neighborhood that is concluding the center of the city. Is really in continuity with the hyper-center of Antwerp, and it's facing the Scheldt River, so there are big landscapes, distances, and in this case the choice was to organize a dense tissue with some higher, taller buildings, maintaining a big park on the background, and of course the view towards the Scheldt. Or in that case, it was an old railway yard, so it was not a fertile land. It was, of course, already urbanized terrain. In this case, this is in France. Is a big neighborhood, La Courouse, in the city of Rennes, in Brittany. And here we made the master plan, and we are designing all the public spaces and all the networks together with the engineers. And then we constructed let's say, the guidelines for architects to realize what you see there. So the densities, the form, the morphologies are decided by us. There were no inhabitants, of course, because it was an old military area, so nobody was living inside. But we had a participation with the people living around this area that was fenced with a wall, so it was completely unknown. And what was important for us was to join the idea of a dense neighborhood with revealing the interest of an area that was polluted, but at the same time developing nature, and also construct new nature. So also working with the open air water collection, the rainwater, we recreated a lot of nature that was not there at the moment. It was just concrete slabs, and we had to reuse. So this was just a premise. I'm not against that. But I want to use the work we made with students in Switzerland. So Switzerland is expecting to grow. So there is a lot of discussion about becoming more numerous. And the tendency seems to be the one of making the cities bigger. So as if all this growth should be into the cities. So let's see if I can use this. You can see, okay, this is Milan, you see. This is the lake of Geneva, or the Leman Lake. So here there is a big pressure, very big pressure on the land. The prices are extremely high, very, very high, let's say. And so for me, this is not clear why those cities should become so much bigger. And what are we doing with all the rest? You see, here, these are the Alps, you can recognize them. And a lot of valleys. What will be the future of that type of territory when everybody wants to live into the city? Why the cities are becoming so attractive? Why there is this problem of densification? So this is the Leman area with the two alpine valleys, the Valais on one side, the Valais de l'Arve on the other side. What happened in those valleys? You see that the densification, they were like that. There were places for water, for the rivers, the Rhône River. And this is the Rhône today, canalized, and this is the type of city. Conurbations, no? That are a lot of infrastructures, trains, highways, etc. So what happening to the rest? So my point is why we want all to live in the cities. Why we are forgetting that we have been living using all the territory. I don't know, but I remember Rem Koolhaas 30 maybe years ago, 25 years ago, imagining Holland in one point, the point city. No? Of course, there were also alternative scenarios. So my point is this densification, there will be more people coming to live in Switzerland. Okay, it's possible. Switzerland will go from 8 million to 10 million. Jakarta is, I don't know, 15 million, so I don't think this is a fundamental problem. But why everybody wants to be into the city? Why we want to create then the problem of densification in the city? Why we want then to demolish, to destroy, to push out citizens that are in the city? Because of the densification, because of the need of densification. I think that we have an incredible, especially Europe, but also many countries in the world, they have incredible support in terms of infrastructures. The territories have been inhabited since ever, let's say. And today they are losing population. So we will not be able in the future to maintain schools, to maintain services, to have people of all ages, young people, elderly people, living, for example, in a village on the mountain. Why don't we invest and regenerate not just the city, but the territory? And maybe we will densify, we will reframe things that are there, so we will densify that, but it will be not only making the city bigger, but restructuring the entire territory that is in need. So the question of technology that was addressed before, why I cannot live in such a village, for example, and working, I know, in a distant or for a distant agency, for example. Why I cannot live in a different way from the past, right? When living in a mountain, on the mountain, was really hard. Why we cannot profit of the technologies we have today to change the way in which we live, for example, in this type of city, this city territory, that I consider a renewable resource. It's a renewable resource if we can reimagine the way to live there. And if not everybody is going into the city, if not all the young people are going into the city, if we maintain some possibilities, we can reframe how, for example, an Alpine Valley can work and can rethink the metabolism of today that is not really profiting of the resources that are there. In this case, for example, what you see here is an ancient airport, abandoned. There are many airports in this part of Switzerland that it was called the Réduit Suisse. So it was where, during the Second World War, there was the hypothesis that in case of invasion from the German side or from the Italian side, Switzerland would have found inside the mountains a kind of protection, a kind of fortress. So that's why there are so many airports, so many military spaces, and all that are occasions for imagining new economies, new possibilities of reuse. And then rethinking, let's say, really the everyday life in this kind of places. We have made with the students this kind of hyper-realistic model in a way really to show what does it mean to densify. These are small densifications, but they are small densifications in order maybe to organize a collective space or to bring some services in the previous one, to bring, for example, the public transport that today is not there because there is not enough movement or there are not enough people. So let's say that densification for me, and here I conclude, can be an occasion if we can avoid to consider that densification is only a problem of the city. It's not a problem only of the core of the metropolis, but is a question for all metropolitan areas, because those villages are not so far away. They are part, in fact, of metropolitan areas, especially if we consider that today we can work more or less everywhere. No? So I think that the bad side of the moment of, let's say, of importance that cities have in our debate, the bad side is the marginalization of large part of our territories. But really, vast part of our territories are marginalized because of that. And when we densify in the center of the city, let's remember that there is a soil. There is an urban soil. So I want to make a pleading for considering the soil as a living part of the city. So when we densify into the already dense areas, many times we forget or we close pieces of still living soil. So we should reflect a lot about that. And finally, to construct a type of metropolis that is not the one of today, very hierarchical, but a horizontal metropolis, a metropolis that can share the benefit of being a metropolis with the vaster territories. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paola Figano. Yeah, but please have a seat. We have one more of these presentations. And wow, I saw you really opening up this for intensification for us like you promised. And I also saw the person in the front really looking like, yes, that's wildlife in the city, isn't it? That's almost like what you meant. So I was promising you guys answers, and you're getting some, right? So now we have Ton Schaap for the final presentation before we move to the conversation. Ton, please take a microphone. Same question for you. Are you autocratic, or do you want me to do the slides for you?
Shall I do it myself?
Sure.
I put some slides together as I was asked about two topics, the participation and densification as a supposed paradox, or opposition even. Well, density is of course very well. You have to decide what it's about. Nowadays in Amsterdam, there's much discussion about this kind of density, the density of people in the most important public spaces in the center of town. There's, of course, the density in buildings. That's the only one where urbanists and politicians can have influence upon. You cannot say to people, don't walk in our inner city. You cannot say, go live somewhere else. But the zoning and the way we build is very much decided by the city, especially because Amsterdam is the landowner in most cases. And then, of course, the whole density discussion started in the island urbanism that we developed along the I-banks. From east to west, the whole harbor zone was, well, transformed into city. And the density was most of the times decided by the city council. It started, in fact, by a decision to build 100 houses on every hectare of former harbor land here on the east side, and here densities go up to 200. In Houthavens, it's even denser, I think, as is the case in Overhoeks. And that was mainly to make competition to suburbia. Because Amsterdam had in 1985 some 650,000 inhabitants. It had come down from 850 to 650. So the city council said, build houses in urban densities, whatever that may be, and make them so attractive that people stay in the city and don't move to Almere, Hoorn, Enkhuizen, and whatever. So this was the main point on the agenda. And if a city doesn't build, it loses inhabitants, because as long as you have money, you want a bigger house every 10 years. The average meters for an Amsterdam inhabitant was 16 in 1965 and is 32 at the moment. So that needs two times as much floor for the same number of inhabitants. So this is the most recent thing that was in discussion. There's a lot of discussion about this last part of this island urbanization. Amsterdammers are used to this 4 stories, street of 15 meters wide. That's the most popular part of town, apart from the canal zone. And if you compare it to Paris, for example, this is an Amsterdam school block, 4 stories. So you can see in Paris it's 2 times as high and 2 times as dense. In this Amsterdam, you will have and almost have a part of Zuidas. I will go a little bit deeper on that. The decision to build the main offices of banks near to the central station Zuid was taken 20 years ago and was economically motivated, I think. The banks wanted to sit there. They didn't want to build on I-banks. They didn't want to go to the central part of town. They needed bigger spaces. So they started here as a car-oriented office complex. That was the start of Zuidas. The crisis was used, 10 years ago, to introduce residential buildings into Zuidas. And we kept more or less the same volumes of buildings. So the density was, in fact, limited only by the building envelopes. And now this whole zone has been transformed into a mixed-use city neighborhood. One of the next steps will be this plan for the Ravel zone. And there the next step has been taken by Martijn de Wit, who made this drawing. He was in the audience, at least he was in the cafe. He's not in the audience, he was only in the cafe. Well, he said, well, if you compare it to the first parts of Zuidas, we can take away the cars altogether and make the whole internal space green, and still we have this same density with this checkerboard system of high-rises and a kind of low-rise base. Well, to explain this, he investigated all these examples that we have recently in the last decades realized in Amsterdam. I'd go into one example, a recently discussed, also in the newspaper, residential complex called Xavier, designed by Pim Keuter. Because what is, of course, not difficult is to make beautiful apartments in the higher levels, but what is, of course, the question is, are the lower levels also good to live in? So here you have some impressions. This is still a render. This is where Daley Blind will live. And this is the view from one of the lower levels. Contact to the street. Zuidas is not a very thick piece of city, it's a very thin slice of city, in fact, that of course offers views. This is one of the spaces. One of the rules in Zuidas is that the ceiling height is always bigger than in the rest of Amsterdam, 3 meters 30 between the two floors, netto. And that gives this kind of experience. And this is the happy couple that is going to live in one of these flats. Participation. The participation in Holland, of course, is very old, because to keep the whole thing dry, we have lots of polders, and the polders are also making war with each other about water. I could talk hours, but participation in Amsterdam made a very big move. It's not always cozy talking, it's just like in Berlin, battles. And this battle changed the city for 40 years, I think, because big car roads through the city were ended here. Keeping the urbanistic structure was the next point for the next 20, 30 years, and the car had to go. Another example, more small scale, is what I can show you here. People who lived in these existing buildings wanted to stay, of course, and we also thought that was a good idea to keep, well, rememberings of the past and nice old buildings in the new plan. In fact, they influenced the urbanism of what was built later here very much, because they said we don't want to be in the shade of one big block. We want to have views through it, and we want to have a kind of more playful setting as a background for our house. That's what we did. These were talks in the buildings like this, with 20, 30 people. Of course, it went very in detail into the backyard, what will be the limit of the backyard, how we will plant this zone, etc., etc. Very direct influence of participation. Here you see another view of the same thing. The photo is 10 years old, I think. With the people living in this building here, I have never been able to become friends, I'm sorry to say. So that is a discussion that was not ended in a friendly way. What did end in a very friendly way was to reorganize houseboats on the quays, and also to find some compromise between the need for parking cars and playing children and the need for entry to the boat, etc., etc., in the profiles of these quays, the South Quays in the Eastern Docklands. And then, of course, what I mentioned earlier, the big thing, the bike instead of the car. And that's my last slide.
Thank you so much. Can I invite you back to one of those chairs? Well, right now I promised you, visiting this session, that you could take part in our discussion. You can participate in two manners. I can give the floor to you and you can ask your question or make a statement. Or maybe you need a bit more time, or you want to participate in a different manner. In that case, you can go to a website called menti.com, www.menti.com. Then you use the code 234142, so 234142, and then you can pose your question or make a statement. And if it makes any sense at all, you know, we'll try to as this panel, we'll try to reflect on whatever statement it is that you're willing to make. But before I move to the first question, let me end this more sanding part of the session with a quick statement of Eric, because Eric, you've been, you know, your book comes to life tonight, and you saw all these presentations. Is there anything that stands out as you would say? Well, that's also a big theme. Now that I've been listening to these presentations.
Well, first of all, I'm very proud once again that the book somehow has already helped to make this possible. I think these were three very impressive presentations. I think maybe I would like to go a little bit more into detail for Paola's presentation, because what's for me, I think this was one example where urban design and can be a research tool and can be a way to help us to imagine a different type of city, a different type of how we live on our territory. So I think it's an excellent example of, maybe a culture that we have to, help evolve more to see these types of presentations and ideas more often. And I think it's very important that our culture also, our urban society insists and makes it possible to make such projects emerge. So it means we need means for the universities to actually envision such projects, and we need
okay, but I would say that this is almost like a meta statement saying let's have more of these nights. But there was also quite a statement being made by Paula, I think, on density, and saying, well, the way we look at density as a one option type of development, that's just not true. There's different ways, all types of different ways to look at density. What do you think about that? Is there more of that in your book, or?
I completely agree, but I think the question, and as I had the luck to get to know Paola's work a little bit, it's not just to say that's right or that's wrong. I think let's actually study this question, and then we look at it, and then we know more. And I think that's something that you call research, and that's something that makes our profession more convincing. So to become more specific, I think in this case, it's something that's true. I think in the beginning of the internet,
right.
I think I had my first email address during my studies in 96, 97. Quite late. But I think there were these kind of theories that we don't need the big city anymore because we could do our work everywhere. Now it turned out to be somehow the opposite, right? We had the cities becoming bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
And I think what we do start to feel, however, is that there's a certain limitation of where we can go. So I think to envision that density is going to be, put on our territory in a different way, is very thought-provoking, and I think it's something where we are probably going towards.
Thanks. Now, Paula, maybe also the same question for all of you, but let's start with you because it's directed to your presentation. Here it says, now, suppose that we're all inspired with your presentation. Now, how do we incentivize people to actually move from cities to those newly densified rural zones? So, how do you get people to live in those newly densified zones that you were presenting?
I don't want to move anyone. I'm just saying that our territories are losing population.
Okay.
So the
so
point
it's not about getting new people there, but it's about having those people stay there.
There might be new people, but the point is the possibility of maintaining this rich type of space that we have realized in centuries of working, not only on the Alps but also in the floodplains. No, we have worked the territory in order to be inhabitable, and I think that today the idea that you can only live if you want to express yourself, the only place in which you can make it is being inside the city. I think is deeply. It's not true.
Okay, so that's an uninformed idea that many people have. But yeah. Okay. Now maybe Recula, for you, would it be a good idea to ban cars even more? I think Ton Schaap came up with that question, but it might also be very much an issue in Berlin, I can imagine.
Yes, it is, but the Berliners, they are not so, they don't drive cars.
They don't drive cars?
No.
So you're beyond that problem?
No, of course they drive cars, yes. We have a lot of cars in the city, but there is a population which is not so rich, and we don't have so many cars like in other cities. But it is a problem, because if you densify the cities, you have a huge problem with the traffic. It's even the bigger problem that we have in the densification. We have always, in every participation project, we are talking about projects. the first question is the question about traffic. It's always like that. And it's very, I think it's one of the biggest challenges. And it's not about the question if high-rise or not high-rise. It's really the question, how can you move the people?
Yeah. Okay, Tom, you were bringing up, you were referring to have the cars out, have the bike in as one of the successes of participation. Do you feel now it's time to build more car-free zones in cities?
I think it will happen.
Yeah?
Because if you have more buildings, you have less space, and you want to use the space better, and pedestrians and children need the space more than cars. So and also this density leads to a lifestyle where use of public transport and bike is possible. If you live on the outskirts of Nieuwegein or Almere, you need a car. You cannot live without a car. But if you live in the Zuidas or in the inner city here or here on the islands, you can very well live without a car.
Okay, so you feel not only it's going to happen, but it's also something that,
it is already
that
happening.
You should promote as a government.
We have already also in Zuidas empty parking garages and lack of parking space for bikes.
Yes.
And some of the new office buildings filled with lawyers and bankers.
And they love their trains, right?
Yeah, well, they have to. They have to. There's no choice.
Okay, I think that Paula, yes.
No, I just wanted to react to this because we were discussing. I think that there should be said more clearly and loudly that the very special situation of Amsterdam, full of bikes, is really the result of a construction, of a dedicated construction. It was not a guarantee. I think that Amsterdam is an example, is a reference from this point of view in Europe, probably all over the world in this moment. And this was not just because you are like that, no? But it was really a continuous work, a very maybe modest.
Hard fight.
Hard.
It didn't happen overnight.
You were saying street by street, and also I think I imagine that the people have participated to this because this is really touching the everyday way to use the city.
Yeah.
And I think that the other cities in Europe should know the story, how, not just the result, not just the fact that today is full of a bicycle path, but how, during decades, no? Because you were saying that it's 35 years, more or less, that this has been...
it started in the generation 60s, 70s, and then there was a new alderman, Michael van der Vlis, and he said, well, we are going to fight them. And, and the Dutch don't like revolutions, so it's not a total turnover in 1 year. It is street by street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood.
Yeah.
So, and then suddenly there was a new project that was car-free, and the cars were put in a garage on the edge of the plan, which is of course also kind of a Dutch solution. But that is also now, well, these cars are also leaving the city.
Now Rekula,
may I say something? It's also something about the scale, you know? It's really a difference if you have a city like 4 million people, which is 10 times bigger than Amsterdam, and you have really different distance. And yes, of course, Berlin has a total different scale, and you have to think about.
You're totally right. But what's developing now in the Randstad, as you see, is the combination of bike and rail. And
yes, of course, yes.
So we are building like madmen parking garages for bikes near stations.
Yeah. And then we are in the question
I think because many, there are so many other topics, but one of them might be interesting for you as well, Rekula, because you were referring to keeping one of these monuments, right? So the House for Statistiek, I think. But now it says, do you also feel that the preservation of these monuments and territory can also be used as a tool to change cities? So,
yes, totally. I think it's very important, and it's, you know, in Berlin everything is very ideological. And what I was talking about the GDR modernism, and after the reunification, the west part and the West Berlin, they took over the east part, and the GDR modernism is a part of the history of this system, and you can say, it was a good system, it was not so good system, but it was kind of a homeland for many people.
Yes.
And so 30 years after reunification, there is a new generation that appreciate also this GDR modernism, because they connect it with other things. And so it's a very, very important for all the cities. It's very, very important because it's a question of identity, of our own identity. And if you look all over the world, if you look what architects produce and investors produce, I mean, it's everywhere the same thing. You can't make any difference. And the heritage, they make the difference in every city.
Okay. Now, but sometimes just to people are saying, well, it's those being nostalgic of what was built in the past is a bit overemphasized, and it makes it hard for people who are new to the city and all these people who migrate into cities to be entitled to create their own worlds or their own type of symbolism. Is there any truth in that statement?
I think that the preservation and the regeneration, the adding new layers is something very creative. It's a very creative process. It's a process of selection, of adding, of taking out something. So this is absolutely a creative problem. But what is fundamental is by that you gain a thick urban realm. And I think the question of the difference is fundamental.
Yeah.
To maintain differences, not to lose differences, is fundamental, because this is a kind of homologization that we have. All projects. I mean, if we want to speak of a little bit of the crisis of urban design, I don't know, maybe Eric can be into that, is exactly the fact that it is really flat. No, I mean, there is a really homogenization.
And this is you're referring to what is actually being designed, what it looks like.
And it's not the same homogenization of the modern era, international style, because behind that there was a strong, let's say, commitment. Maybe then it was forgotten, but there was at least at the beginning a strong
social
kind of idealistic commitment.
Right.
While behind this, there is not really that same commitment. So I think that when densification is a way to erase the differences, I think we should be very attentive about that.
Eric, I think maybe you can elaborate on this, but also a fascinating statement, I think, for you, and then I'll ask the audience, maybe there's somebody who doesn't want to type but still's got a question. But I think this is also challenging, and it might be a point that's implicitly made by all your guests. So we're focusing on these major cities that are growing, but what then is the opportunity and challenge for mid-sized and satellite cities? Do they fit into your book or your perspective at all?
Well, I think that this is a very good point. It comes a little bit back to this, the discussion and Paula's presentation here. I think that there's indeed, our discourse and the way it's translated through the media, depends on small things. It depends on big things what happens in our world. So I think, when we had in the early 2000s all these projects by, many Dutch architects as well going on in the Middle East, in Dubai, or in China, somehow I think this had an influence on the kind of the discussions that we had. What were we looking at? What was the definition of urban design for us? And I think there's something similar going on with, the focus on the very big cities. So I think you were completely right. You started with saying, we're in the age of the city, the 21st century, and obviously the growth is going to continue. But I think this, and I'm not an expert at it, but the question of going, looking back at what's happening in mid-sized and smaller cities is definitely a topic which is already there, but I think is going to have much more attention in the future.
Maybe who made this statement? Maybe the person who made this statement, because it seems to make so much sense. Could you elaborate a bit on it? So you were posing it. Do you feel that there's too much emphasis on metropolises, or why did you make that statement?
Well, I made a statement because, in the Netherlands, what Ton already mentioned, like we had in the 60s, 70s, 80s, where people would move out of the city. And now we see these people are coming back, or at least their children are coming back. But then actually we're facing the other problem, like these cities will get emptier. So how do they profile themselves in the future? And I think it would be interesting maybe not to think, I think the Rijksbouwmeester, Floris Alkmaar, already mentioned like the rural areas are maybe becoming even more interesting in the 21st century because the cities will resolve themselves, but how do these rural areas profile themselves and how can they?
I think your point is made clear. Now there's 4 wise people. Anyone who would you say, well, answer this for me?
I would like to answer from Paula.
Okay, Paula, did you understand this question?
Yeah, of course.
Could you answer it?
I think that when you are talking of mid-sized city or satellite city, this is a way to describe the urban territories, no, in which we live. And if we assume that the form of the city is not the form of the city of the Middle Age or even, I don't know, of the 19th century. So the city has deeply changed its morphology. It's not the city that we are still used to consider as something compact. Then we have the problem of the compact city. The only sustainable formula is the compact city. The problem is that our territories are inhabited and are urban. They are urban because we are urban. Even the rural territories you are talking about, or the rural cities, they are urban. So we have to consider, we have to imagine a project for this type of city. And when we speak of densification, that's why I wanted to enlarge. We are talking of the densification. That is something, as I said, historically happening. No, it's something that is not so new. But we have to use it not to, to come back to leave for a moment the problem of competitiveness among cities, among territories. I'm not saying that you have to come back to the old decentralization, to the old, let's say, solidarity among territories, but something similar, yes. Maybe with the new technologies, maybe with a new spirit, because we have a new criteria, etc. But please stop with this idea of the compact city as the only solution. We are abandoning territories by that. We are not valorizing other territories. So I think we need to work on all of them, and there is so much to regenerate, to recycle.
Ton Schaap and then Eric, because the compact city is basically, I would say, the city's ideology, right? It's our way to preserve nature. But now you
preserve nature. That's the point. It's not because you consider what has been realized in the last centuries that you forget nature. On the contrary.
Mm-hmm. Okay, could you briefly respond to Paula?
It certainly is happening. Colleagues of mine are now migrating out back to the regions where they came from. Houses become too expensive, and jobs are there. Because the jobs is always the driving force. And Amsterdam has far too many jobs for its inhabitants. It has 630,000 jobs, so many people have to come here. Mm-hmm. And if you have to commute every day, you want to live there because the commute time is, well, lost time. So that is the problem. The jobs should also go. So I don't have the solution. I do also work in Hengelo and Enschede, which are, regions where there's no growth and there's also no shrink. So they are stable. They want to stay stable. So but it's really much more difficult to do something in these regions because there's no money for investment, because nobody wants to invest. It's still totally car-dominated, so the children think, well, let's move to Amsterdam because there's the nice life with the bike and the nice job and also the nice partner that you can find in the city much easier than in Hengelo or Enschede.
Yeah, Eric?
Well, I had to think about the Yellow Vest movement in France.
Just like Paula,
so you've probably heard about it. And now I think there might be a simplification that all this, this movement came only from rural areas, but it seems to be in large parts the case. So at a certain point, also there's a political situation in which we have to react. And there is a truth that over the last years, the public sector has, closing more and more of, post offices, whatever kind of public amenities in such areas. And politically, this shows, economically and politically, shows, unfortunate results. And so it seems like there's something to do.
Okay. And would you then say the only way, let's say that we want to keep these small town and satellite cities alive, it seems to require major public investments because nobody is going to pay for that, or do I then misunderstand you?
You mean where's the money coming from?
Well, where's the money coming from?
Well, but if you see the reaction of the French government and President Macron is, they organized the Grand Débat and decided to, invest more money for these kind of issues. So I don't know exactly now what it's going to be. I think at this stage maybe nobody does, but I think these political decisions have to follow.
So this is your French blood telling us, just go out there, protest, and money will pop up.
Well, I guess at a certain point.
You hear that, Tom?
Yeah, but I think also the reforms that are needed in agriculture will be a game changer, because in parts of the country where it's all mass production of meat and things, well, they will have to find out new ways of making money, and that will attract new investment also. But that is going to start small. Exactly as the transformation of Eindhoven also started very small and difficult and slowly. And then suddenly something becomes a success, and then, well, now perhaps we are seeing the end of it, and we need to look again at the other parts of the city, because the whole of the Netherlands is more or less one system.
Anyone here in the audience who says, well, my question is not on there, but I want to ask a question anyway or make a statement? No. In that case, there's a couple of people who are asking you, Eric, or the others, can we already design for the future? I would say let's leave that as our final challenge. But for now, Rekord, I think this more or less refers also to your presentation. If you could scroll back, there was one about whether we should involve more artists, filmmakers, so whether the design process of the city should not make use more of artists. You don't think planners should be working more often with filmmakers and media personnel to popularize ideas that are good for the general, good against more physical personal spaces? Do you directly understand what it means, or should we ask?
Yeah, I don't know, but
who's responsible for this statement? Maybe a short clarification. It's almost like a poem.
English is not my first language, so it's difficult for me. Mainly, this question is directed to Paula. It's to discuss the idea that it's getting. I mean, for the young generation, it's cool to move to the city because this is where all the movie industry happens. This is where all the songs and the pop culture usually happens in the city. So is it a good idea if you want to change the idea of moving to the cities? Should we change also the culture and the popular culture that's surrounding it or that's surrounding the city?
Yeah, I agree. There is this need to construct a new gaze and a new way to look at things. And then this is something that has already happened in many places. We were looking at the contemporary space, urban space in the past with different eyes. We were judging ugly things that today we think are, on the contrary, aesthetically very interesting. This same transformation has already happened for many other parts of the territory. For example, maybe you have heard of this idea of a diffuse city that has been used in Italy to describe this kind of a different type of city that was not the traditional one. And I think the work made by photographers, a school of photographers especially from Venice, but also from Rome and Milan. So the work they did has shown, finally has revealed this space as an aesthetic object, not just as a problem, not just as a domestic place, but really as an aesthetic object. And I think this is fundamental. And 15 years ago, we founded, also with TU Delft, European master in urbanism, and we decided to have photographers involved in the work with the students, because we think that I go back to what Eric was saying about the role of design or investigation, exploration. I think that what you can do in this way with the photographers, with the video artists, with other type of visual artists and architects, designer, urban designer, is really to put into the debate something that then can generate a different approach, a different position.
Okay. I'm going to move to Regula, because you seem to make what I think for Dutch eyes and ears was so interesting about your presentation was the emphasis you put on provocative images, artist images, and also the battle. But let's stick first with this question: is that something that you generally do? Invite artists to look differently at places, shake things up?
Yes, especially in participation processes. Normally, people, they can't read plans. It's only for architects and planners, and you have to find other ways to talk about urban space. And so often the photographers or artists or even people from the theater, they find other instruments how you can involve people really in a discussion. You can't involve them with normal plans. You just can't.
Okay, so that would be the idea, to make people understand a plan. So what they're seeing makes them engage with the plan. But here the statement even goes beyond that, and that's, you can also use artists to reimagine a plan or to come up with a different plan. Would you call that also the Berlin approach, or just a sound thing to do?
You're talking.
Yeah. I was wondering whether you have experience with that as well. So using art as a game changer instead of making it to understand plan.
Yes, that's what I was talking about.
Oh,
so
okay.
Artists in Berlin were fundamental, I would say.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, of course.
Okay, yeah, no, I was under the wrong impression that you used artists to make people understand what a plan was actually about. Okay.
It's both.
It's both.
It's both.
Okay. Eric, we're nearing the final minutes of this session. So a couple of people have been posing statements and questions about the future, because designing for change also means that you know how to deal with change, right? So here, for example, somebody said, can we already design for a future crisis, flood, heat? This is really a dystopia that we're that we're nearing. But let's say you basically know that things are going to change, right? And you want to design for that. That's also why your book is about 2020 and it's not even 2020. So can you give us some of the ideas of what should change in education or the way urban design is approached, and any thoughts on that big question?
Well, I think first of all, it's really the whole sense of what we are doing, right? Particularly in academia as well, right? I mean, if you work in a private practice, you have to build for now. But I think in academia, whatever project you do is to somehow prepare for the future. So, I mean, this is like, if all this comes at the same time, obviously it's quite dramatic. So it's not going to be easy, but I think that's all of the discussions in this book are essentially about this question. So it's difficult for me to summarize it. I think it's maybe, this book has a specificity. It's not just about the city, but it's actually about what how urban designers see their role in city making.
Right, but if you then move back to some of the examples, and we already had the governments in the Netherlands, but also other governments, they're tearing good buildings down. Because they just, they're associated with social problems, or they do not fit the idea of what a city should be in 2019. Is that changed now? Is that not going to happen anymore?
To do what? To tear down?
That we're building a nice building now of 50 million euros, and 15 years from now we will tear it down?
That's a good idea. I hope not. You know, I was just a couple of weeks ago in New York and saw the building that some of you might have seen, the vessel, built somehow at the end of the High Line, and I think they invested over $200 million in something which is kind of a sculpture on which you can go walk up and down, right? However, surrounded by tall towers, so which doesn't really give the same experience as the Eiffel Tower, right? So I was wondering if this, for example, is a way of creating a city icon, which is not really following these ideas of sustainability and resilience that we are so much talking about. So I think there's also a certain tension between the city marketing and an enormous amount of money which is spent for it, and then the actual question of how does it help the people who live there?
Okay.
I would like to answer the question in this way. I mean, it could be. It could happen because if we are not able to also make experiments, then we can't develop cities, and we can't invent the future. And I think, yes, sometimes you also make mistakes. And if you are totally afraid of making mistakes, so you should stop doing things. And that's why, maybe it could be.
Okay, and is that something, so you told us good urban designers are already aware of that they should be designing for the future, but your plea is more about providing also room for experiments, invest in stuff that you might need to tear down.
Yes, of course. It's very, very, very
even
important.
1 billion euros, just
No, no, of course not.
Okay, so a small amount.
Yeah, it's a small amount, but it could be because we really have to make experiments.
Okay.
That's very, very important, and we shouldn't be totally afraid.
No. Paula, same question for you. Can we already design for the future crisis? Well, education and a good urban design mind is needed.
Yes. No, I think that the question of the future has to be taken as a habit. Let's say we should never close it.
No.
And I think the interest of being designers, in this period, is that we have to reinvent a lot of things. And when we say designing the transition, the transition that is ecological, but is also social, is also economic. This means a lot for the project of the city. And I think this makes this moment difficult, because I think there are a lot of difficulties, but at the same time extremely motivating. And I think that also in relation to participation, this is where I think the discussion with the citizens, with the people that are participating to a certain transformation, this is really a common problem for everybody. And there is not expert or non-expert. We have common problems. And I think like also deciding to leave the car at home or not to use the car anymore is a problem for everybody. It's not that the experts have solved the problem. The citizens are very often is the opposite. The citizens maybe are already much far away. Maybe the politicians are not as far as some of their citizens.
So the problem for everybody is being aware of that transition.
I think that we have a common question, a common problem, and this can be also a way to reframe participation, reframe the way to work together. There is no, let's say, lesson to be given. There is really a lot to learn from each other.
Tom?
Totally agree. Yeah. And you can never design for a crisis. That's of course the thing. That's why it's a crisis. You always design for some predictable future that cannot last too long. And then if there's a crisis, you react. So as in Zuidas, we reacted by the office building crisis by starting to build apartments.
Right.
Skip the offices, start apartments. Skip parking garages, make bike garages. This goes very quick, in fact. These are small things. That's what humans can do, and we are not God. We cannot. If the sea level rises, Amsterdam will have to be rebuilt on the Veluwe, and we will, in the end, not keep it dry. That's very simple. And we don't know it, of course. Will it happen? When will it happen? Of course, we don't want it because we love our city. But and these things, well, they don't occupy my mind every day, luckily enough.
So you deal with it when it gets there, but the awareness is always there, you know, to put it more positively.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. I see. I was going to ask the audience for one or two final statements. I see Frank Alsma over there in the back. I happen to know one of the members of the audience by coincidence. Anyone else who would say, well, before everybody leaves here and Eric can thank us all for being with him, I really need to make a final statement. Yes, so it's you and then Frank, and then it's you, Eric. You get the word, not the microphone. That's like moderation lesson number 1.
First of all, thanks a lot for all these very insightful comments and visions. I just want to nuance a little bit the last statement of you can't design for a crisis. Of course, certain crises are unforeseeable and you cannot prepare for what is completely unforeseeable, but you can try to design the city as a more resilient system. And I think that's one big challenge that wasn't really talked about today. How can you make the city more productive, more vibrant, and rely on more sources also? And it was also about involving the users and the habitants more in creating also this productive system. But yeah.
So the city is becoming more resilient and being more of a productive system itself, while including all its citizens. That's your statement, right? That's what we should think more about. Almost. Well, one more try.
Almost. I just also want to say, of course, it's not only about big metropolitan areas and big urban cores. It's also about making the smaller rural urban areas, which I really liked that approach also from Paola today. How can also villages and smaller cities become more attractive by being more productive and therefore more resilient?
Okay, thanks. And also thank you for pointing that nuance out to us. And then finally, before we move to Eric, your final statement.
Well, it was the question you were answered was our question together. And it was a question composed out of the different subjects of this week. Because it's not crisis in that sense, it's already happening. So I spoke to the last days. I live in Amsterdam North, and we get people from the Philippines, urban services who are searching in Holland for how to deal with the lands which drowns down the sea. So they have islands which goes for the sea level uprising already. Nadia's coming from Mersin in Turkey. It's a city overflooded with refugees from 40,000 people from Syria living there, trying to live there. Yesterday there was a meeting for Waternet. We were having a map of 2050 in Holland where the border of the sea was at Ommen. It's a serious map. It's about the sea level rise. So it's not a crisis. It is 20 years farther away. So I think, and I'm totally not agree what Ton Schaap says in the sense we see for the crisis. No, we have to design for change. The change is there. And it is not crisis.
It's reality.
It's a reality. It's a clever way of designing, and I think designers must do this. And it's also about a lot of these things are being built now, and we have to think of that. Maybe we throw it away because in 20 years it will not be there anymore. Yeah. So I think it's. I came here a bit for designing change. This was my idea about designing change.
Okay, thank you. And also thank you for elaborating on that. I heard that Ton is always open for a good debate at the bar. But for now, Eric, it's your night to some extent. So let's give you the final words of this evening.
Well, the debate at the bar sounds pretty attractive. So let's go there quickly. Well, thank you very much. Once again, I think for me it was a great honor to bring Ton together with Regula and Paola. I think this is really an occasion for exchange, which, as I said, doesn't happen actually that often, and gives ideas to decision takers which can change. Regarding the last comment, I think a couple of days ago I was running around in Paris and and thought about the construction of the metro, which must have happened somewhere around 1900, and I said, well, at this time, the traffic probably wasn't that terrible that you had to build such a huge network of a metro line. And,
well, don't forget about the horses, Eric.
Sure, but you could have done something else. I'm saying that I felt a certain optimism there that I think we should find. I think we are also in a kind of a logic of being constantly showing that we are shocked about something, then we are alarmed. I think we should also be optimistic about the future, right? And try to find solutions. And I think that's what you're doing as well.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Eric, yeah, because now it's becoming this bar debate, which is fine, but we need like 30 seconds more. So you're saying there's a reason to be optimistic. Frank in the back is saying, yes, that's what design is all about.
Well, that's what it is. I think I would like to just finish with the words that we should look forward to such a fantastic task to do so, and I think we are able to find solutions because this has happened, for humanity since it existed. So we should put pressure on politicians, do work even more, even better. But I believe that we will find solutions if we really fight for them and are looking for those. And
okay, thank you so much for this final optimistic statement. Thanks for all the speakers. Thanks to you guys for being here. There's a book you can actually buy. I'm not sure if somebody mentioned it, but the whole night was about a book. And let's stay together and have a nice conversation about these issues at a bar. But for now, thank you so much, Ton Schaap, Eric Furley, Recula Luce, and Paula Vigano.